I've had a great time here. The tour of the campus I thoroughly enjoyed. I enjoyed speaking to students earlier today, and it's kind of embarrassing when I spoke to those students. I'm thinking how much more impressive they were than when I was a college student. It's almost embarrassing. So you guys are doing a fantastic job, and it's a real honor to be here. So I'm going to talk about how we have a 21st century problem that has an 18th century cure, and I'm going to center it around the problem of religious liberty, free speech, and the rights of conscience. And I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about diversity, okay, and a little bit about how we take diversity for granted. And then I'm going to move on from that. So let's start a little bit in talking about diversity. So I live outside of Nashville, Tennessee, in a town called Franklin. Now, those of you who don't know Nashville very well, you maybe think of it as a conservative town. Some people might think of it as the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. It's actually the Jerusalem of evangelical Christianity in the United States of America. It's the home of the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. It's the home of the Christian music industry. It's the home of an awful lot of gospel music. It's the home of the Christian publishing industry. All right there in Nashville. So we are mega church central. I mean, when I'm talking about the kinds of mega churches where they have to have traffic, police directing traffic to get in and out, and there's this road called Franklin Road. Franklin Road runs north and south through my town, through Nashville. And if you drive down Franklin Road, you will pass basically a large church of every conceivable Christian-based religious denomination in the United States. Gigantic Presbyterian Church USA, not far from its arch rival, a pretty big Presbyterian Church of America. Pass to the First Baptist Church, then on to the Third Baptist Church, then the East Side Church of Christ, then the North Side Church of Christ, and you just go on and on and on, and you'll pass church after church after church as you run up and down Franklin Road, and nobody thinks a thing about it. Well, that's just Nashville. In fact, when you pass church after church after church, the way we think of diversity nowadays, right, we think, man, Nashville's not really a diverse place. Everyone here seems to be a Christian of some sort. And you just think this isn't diversity. Nashville, unlike, say, New York or San Francisco, isn't nearly as diverse. And you think of that as sameness. We now look at that and we think of that as sameness. And the other day I was driving down Franklin Road, and I started to look at it in a different way. In the midst of our polarized times, I started to look at Franklin Road, and I thought of it not as sameness and uniformity, but as an achievement and a miracle. Because I started to think back and have think a little bit harder about diversity. This is a diversity that we take for granted. If you look at that same lineup of churches and you rewind the clock, not too far by the standards of Western civilization, rewind the clock a couple hundred years, 300 years, and you have that same lineup of religious denominations running north-south, and it would be a little bit different. So instead of the main rivalry was going to be who's going to let out first to get to the closest restaurant, instead of rivalries happening on softball fields, as they do, basketball courts, as they do, high school football fields, as they do, they'd be a little bit different. Let's see, like a Presbyterian bulletin on Franklin Road, instead of 2019 being, say, 1689, might say, or 1659, might say, worship service, Sunday school at 10, worship service at 11, potluck at 12, Anabaptist burning at 1 p.m. And we look at this and we forget what an incredible achievement we have, that we take for granted the fact that we can run up and down one road and in a spirit of unity and fellowship connect in both separate islands, but also in a connected stream, so many different strands of this great historic faith of Christianity. And I think about that because we lose historical perspective. And we often think of the founders as not diverse. And we think of the founding as not an example of diversity in action. It's all what? Right. It's all white, propertied Christian men who gathered together and put a society together for themselves. But let's actually look back at it at the perspective of the time. Let's look back at it. If you go through the eyes, not of a 2019 person driving Franklin Road, but you go through the eyes of a 1789, 1790, 1791 person with a very different recent view of history. And let's walk down the eastern seaboard of the United States of America for a minute. So you start off up north. You've got the old Massachusetts Bay Colony. Originally designed as a shining city on a hill, it was going to be basically a theocracy. I think that's a relatively fair way to say it. Not the most tolerant place, but had fled a lot of intolerance to create their own community. So there's Massachusetts Bay Colony, a little bit of checkered past, mainly around alleged witches. Goes south, and then you have Rhode Island and Roger Williams, founded by Roger Williams, who was expelled very tolerantly from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Head down a little bit more, you got some Dutch in New York, and then you get to the Quakers in Pennsylvania. Quakers, I'm still not quite sure what Quakerism is, but it's not Puritanism. Then you go from Pennsylvania, you go to Maryland. I wonder who settled in Maryland. And then just south of that is Virginia, heavily Anglican Virginia. And then you go down a little bit more from there and you go to Georgia, criminals in Georgia, where they still are criminals in Georgia. And you think about that, and the 2019 mind says that's Franklin Road, right? That's Franklin Road. Well, the 1791 mind says those are basically all the theological strains that fought in the wars of religion. The wars of religion, which were, before the World Wars, arguably the most devastating military conflict to both military and civilian life in modern history. Horrifying, horrible, terrifying, looting, pillaging, burning, just horrifying chapter in world history. And all of the theological strands, or most of the theological strands of that conflict, were right there on the eastern seaboard of the United States of America, and the mission was, make a united nation out of these people. And oh, by the way, it's never been done in human history. Nothing like this has been done in human history. So make a nation out of these people. And we look back on it as, well, of course that happened. We had so much in common. There was, that we look back on this again with this 2019 mindset that looks at Franklin Road and doesn't look at the wars of religion. And so we have this intense division. And how did we deal with this? How do you make this happen? How do you bind them together? And I think the answer there is found. It's found really in two documents. Well, 3 or 4 documents, but let's go with 2. It's found in 2 documents. One of them is one of my favorite. Now, I'm going to say these words out loud, and you're going to realize what a ridiculous nerd I am. It's found in one of my favorite Federalist papers, not Federalist 65, which is the impeachment paper that everyone's reading right now. No, Federalist 10. Federalist 10. James Madison is writing in Federalist 10 about how do you deal with the problem of violent faction. In other words, how do you deal with a problem where you have bitterly divided people? How do bitterly divided people live together in a common community? Sounds like a pretty relevant question for today, doesn't it? I mean, we talk about violent faction as another word for what we would call today negative polarization. Negative polarization. This is sort of a term of art that's bandied about in a lot of polling and discussions about American divisions. And what is negative polarization? It's really easy to define. It is basically that I belong to a tribe, whether it's Team Red or Team Blue, not because I have an immense amount of affection for either the members of my tribe or the ideas of my tribe, but because I have an immense amount of animosity for the members of the opposing tribe. I hate or fear the opposing tribe. And so it's sort of this phenomenon you see where there might be extreme discontent in a primary. The Bernie bros going against Hillary, and then when it's all over, it's like, do you want Trump to win? And the same thing in the Republican primary. One of the most divided Republican primaries in modern age. Trump was elected with the lowest percentage of the primary vote since the primary era began, since the open primary era began, and yet there was an enormous amount of unity. Why? Because you can't possibly let Hillary win. And so you have two forces that are motivated mainly by animosity for each other. Now, this is when there's historians in the room. They're right now in there. I know what's happening. They're well actualing me in their heads. You know that person who's like, you hear a statement and they immediately go, well, actually, David, if you want to talk about negative partisanship, this has always been a problem in politics. For example, there used to be a campaign slogan that was, "Ma, Ma, where's my paw? Gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha," about illegitimacy, and that a presidential candidate was guilty of, had an illegitimate child. And you can just go on, and you say, well, actually, if you want to talk about negative partisanship, there was an example where the Vice President of the United States shot dead the former Secretary of the Treasury. You may know about this because they made a musical about it. And so, yes, I know there has been negative partisanship. I know there has been vicious anger in American politics for a long time. But here's what we also know. That we have been tracking, not just amongst the elites, not just amongst the partisans, not just amongst politicians who go at it all the time and always have and always will, but amongst regular, average, everyday people, the level of hatred for each other is spiking. And it's not just the era of Trump. I mean, a lot of times I think people are now viewing politics like we have BC, we have AD, and we have AE. So AE is after escalator, after Trump came down the escalator. Like everything that happened BC and AD doesn't matter. Politics started in June 2015 when Trump came down the escalator. That's ridiculous. Even going back to, but in the Obama era, let's talk about some negative partisanship numbers from the Obama era. In 2014, Pew Research Institute, which is in many ways a gold standard in political research, put out some numbers, and these numbers were about negative partisanship. And what percentage of Republicans, if you asked them what they thought of Democrats, would respond that they either strongly or somewhat disliked the Democrat. That was their impression. Strongly dislike or somewhat dislike. Excuse me. And the answer was 82% of Republicans either strongly or somewhat disliked a Democrat. If only the thing they knew about them is they're a Democrat, 82% strongly or somewhat disliked them. It's a pretty sobering number. Now, what were the Democrats like? Well, Democrats are incredibly tolerant, and this polling was no exception to that. A mere 78% of Democrats either strongly or somewhat disliked a Republican. And so this is 2014. By 2019, some of the numbers in different polling, you could see up towards these numbers arcing towards upwards of 85% of Republicans ascribed strong negative characteristics to Democrats. And with same percentages, 84, 85%, you're beginning to see even significant numbers of Americans, sometimes around the neighborhood of, say, 20%, which you think, oh, only 20%. Well, that's 60 million people would believe things like, I ascribe subhuman characteristics to my opponents. Or America would be better off if large numbers of my opponents just died. Does it get worse than death? No, inhumanity and death. You would have large percentages of people who would believe that a violent response to a lost election was entirely appropriate. We're now beginning to reach large percentages of people who believe that speech that they don't like can be the equivalent of violence. That's how much animosity we have. So that's negative polarization. That's what James Madison would call violent faction. And so what does James Madison say about that? So the founders were not, they knew about violent faction. They just fought a revolution, for crying out loud. They had seen the Articles of Confederation lead to an immense amount of chaos in the country. They knew about violent faction. They knew about divisions. So what did James Madison say? How do you deal with violent faction? And he said you can either try to deal with the causes of it or you can deal with the effects. Now, and if you try to deal with the causes of it, you're going to run into trouble. You can try to make everyone think the same things. You can try to induce uniformity in the population. But as you induce you're grasping at straws if you're attempting to do that. And there's no way to do that without restricting liberty. And James Madison called liberty, he used the term oxygen to describe the operation of liberty in the body politic, especially in a pluralistic country. So if you're going to try to deal with the cause of violent faction by trying to create uniformity, you're going to run into an immense challenge, especially in a nation as ornery as the United States of America. Think about ornery layer one. They're the descendants of people who had been fed up enough with their mother countries, in many cases, to make a perilous ocean voyage and to establish a new settlement in a new territory in a place very, very, very far from home. That's a generally kind of ornery class of person. And then ornery number two, just ornery enough to break off from one of the world's great superpowers, fight a multi-year war and prevail, and you're going to say to that group of people, yeah, I'm going to make y'all all think alike. No, it'd go over then about as well as it'd go over now. We're not going to make you think alike. So what does Madison say is the solution? Well, Madison says the solution is not that you suppress liberty so that everyone to induce uniformity. It is that you protect liberty so that many different factions can flourish and flower. And so that no one faction ever becomes powerful enough to overcome the others, but many different factions flourish and flower. And let's go to the second document. What is the second document? This is, again, Madison at his best. First Amendment of the United States of America. The First Amendment of the United States of America is virtually, in many ways, Federalist 10 operationalized. And this is the amendment that says there will be no state church. The government may not interfere with your free exercise of religion. It will not pass a law abridging the freedom of speech. It will grant you freedom of association. It will allow you to petition the government for the redress of your grievances. It's one of the greatest single sentences ever written in the history of humanity, although it's kind of awkward to read and not particularly super awesomely crafted. But it is still a phenomenal sentence. It is one sentence that says both as you as an individual and us as a collective group of people are going to be free enough in this country to flourish and to advance our ideas and have a hope for change. It's a remarkable document. It's an incredibly powerful document. It creates the right, and it doesn't create, it recognizes the right that Frederick Douglass, in the heart of the darkness of the slave era in the United States of America in 1860, said that free speech is the dread of tyrants. It is the great civic and moral renovator of society. Frederick Douglass believed that that the auction block could not survive free speech. And a lot of you would say, well, it did, because there was a First Amendment and a lot of auction blocks. But the First Amendment did not protect an individual against state governments at that time. And so the states in the South were incredibly suppressive of free speech, especially suppressive of abolitionist speech. And Frederick Douglass had such a faith in the power of reason and faith channeled through freedom of speech that he believed it could crush even the auction block. That's a remarkable statement, just an absolute remarkable statement. And so what I would say is we already right now in the midst of negative polarization and violent faction have the means of dealing with this. And we have the means of dealing with this by protecting not just our own liberty, but the liberty of others so that many flowers can bloom, as opposed to seeking to stamp out all other flowers and leave only one remaining, which James Madison and the founders would recognize not only as a fool's errand, but as an action that would lead to ever greater and more violent faction, therefore cultivating the very terrible state of affairs that you try to avoid. Now, why are we moving right now in such a speed in many ways away from liberty and towards this violent faction? And I think the answer here is really pretty simple. It's our commitment to animosity is outstripping our commitment to liberty. Our commitment to animosity is far greater in many circumstances than our commitment to liberty. There's an interesting bargain that the founders struck with you and I. They struck it with the generation of their time, and they struck it with every generation to follow. And that bargain was this. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the First Amendment that we have been endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then he later goes on to describe how governments were instituted among men to protect these liberties. In other words, the focus of government, not exclusively, government should work for the common good, government should work for the greater good, but the focus of government is the protection of liberty. So you fast forward a few years, and here you have John Adams writing to the Massachusetts militia. And this is after the Constitution has been ratified, which is the Constitution is essentially the Declaration of Independence codified. And he says that our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. That's the famous quote from that letter. But you should read the whole thing, because what it goes on to say is, if the people abandon a commitment to virtue, the liberties in the United States of America would make America unfit for human habitation. And the Constitution itself is too weak to rescue us if the people abandon virtue. So the great bargain of the founders was, a multi-generational bargain of the founders was, we're giving you a government that recognizes and protects your God-given liberty. Your reciprocal responsibility to us is to exercise that liberty with virtue, for virtuous purposes. And if either side breaks that compact, this experiment starts to crumble. And what I would say right now is we are breaking that compact, not just in a lot of the ways that are obvious to us as we see various kinds of moral decay in this country, and as we see the rise of various philosophies that are, in many ways, especially to those of us who believe the great truths of Christianity, in many ways deeply repugnant ideas. But we're also breaking that compact through our animosity. That animosity itself breaks the compact. If the government is going to give us liberty, at the very least we cannot use that liberty to foster the very animosity that could destroy it. Now, how can animosity destroy liberty? It's pretty easy. I'll give you a great example from a case that was just decided, an injunction that was just issued this week, yesterday in fact, in the Western District of Michigan. There's a Catholic charities organization called St. Vincent's. It places children for foster care and adoption. Upholding the teachings of the church, it does not counsel and it does not provide letters of recommendation for placement for families, for unmarried families or same-sex married families. It provides, for example, it will then, if an unmarried family comes in and seeks foster services or adoption services, what St. Vincent's would do is to refer them to another organization that would provide the services that they sought. But St. Vincent's would not do it. And St. Vincent's had helped build a community of foster care providers and adoptive families that loved to work with and gained immense benefit from working with a charity that shared their values and understood their heart. This is classic American freedom. And the state of Michigan in 2015 even passed a state law, that said that the religious liberty of a Catholic charity or any other Christian charity or any other charity of any other religion is not going to be required to violate their religious principles as a condition for maintaining its right relationships with the state. Well, then in 2018, a different state government comes into power. And this state government, the Attorney General candidate for the state of Michigan, runs and during the race says the people who are seeking to protect the religious liberty of this Catholic charity are hate mongers. Hate mongers. Now, this is one thing, y'all, I have a whole album side on how the secular world calls Christian love hate. And I push back on that every time I hear it. And y'all should too, by the way. By the way, every time a Christian is called a bigot for upholding the teachings of the church, I think we should remind people that the teachings of the church are grounded in the infinite love of our Creator, and that the rules that govern the life of those who live within the church are designed for the health and the well-being of the flourishing of human beings who benefit from the infinite love of an eternal creator. That is the opposite of hate. Never, ever, I never let that pass. I never let that pass. But she said it's hate mongering. Hate mongering. And that the only reason why the state of Michigan would pass a law that protects that religious liberty is because the state of Michigan cares more about discriminating against gays than it cares about children. That is when your commitment to animosity outstrips your commitment to liberty. It's a perfect example. Think about the Masterpiece Cake Shop case. In the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, a same-sex couple comes in and asks a Christian baker to prepare a custom cake to celebrate their same-sex union. The baker, who is a small O Orthodox Christian, believes that religion is marriage is the union of a man and a woman, says, I will serve you on other grounds. You can have one of my pre-prepared cakes, but I will not make a custom cake to celebrate a union that I object to. I can't do that, consistent with my conscience. Rather than go to any one of the dozens of other bakers which would make exactly what they wanted, they go to the Colorado Civil Rights Commission and file a complaint. And the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, in the proceedings deciding the case, says that the religious liberty argument that Jack Phillips used, and if you ever meet Jack Phillips, and I hope you someday get the chance, he's one of the kindest and most gentlest people you'll ever meet, that his arguments were like the arguments that justified slavery and the Holocaust. A little overstatement there. And that they were deeply repugnant. Deeply repugnant. Again, animosity trumps liberty. A commitment to animosity trumps liberty. And in both of those cases, fortunately, in one, the Supreme Court Masterpiece Cake Shop, Justice Anthony Kennedy, the architect of the Obergefell same-sex marriage decision, was appalled. He was appalled by the overt religious targeting. And he wouldn't tolerate that overt religious targeting and ruled for Jack Phillips. In the Western District of Michigan, the judge was appalled by that overt religious targeting and said animosity cannot trump liberty. So right now, guys, we're kind of doing pretty well on the law. On the law, we're not doing well on the culture. We're not. And I hate to tell you, while the law, I am more fearful, for example, of the government in many ways than private citizens, because the government can come at you with bayonets and private citizens tend to come at you with tweets. You cannot maintain a culture of liberty side by side with a culture of animosity indefinitely. You cannot. Animosity will ultimately defeat liberty. And if animosity defeats liberty, this violent faction, this negative polarization will consume this country. Just consume it completely. So what do we do about it? What do we do about it? There's two things. One is the easy answer. Keep defending liberty. I mean, that's how we vote now. That's how we think about politics now. We need the right judges. We need to fund lawyers. We need to pass regulations. We need to really double down on defending liberty. We got to defend liberty, because if we don't defend liberty, then St. Vincent's will have to close. There's a case of a Catholic Charities in Philadelphia. If it doesn't win its Supreme Court case, it will likely have to close. We just saw a case in California where a Catholic hospital was going to be compelled to perform a transgender transition surgery. That hospital may have to close. So you have to defend liberty, right? You have to. That's true. 100%. 100% true. But it's also true if we have two problems, and a threat on liberty and a problem with animosity, we also have to deal with the animosity. And that's where it gets hard. That's where it gets really hard, because that's when you start to get into the love your enemies territory. That's when you get into the bless those who persecute you territory. That's difficult. That's the way of the cross many times. That's hard. So how can we do that in these times? How? How is it possible? Well, I've come up with, and I've talked a lot about what I call a legal corollary to the golden rule. Fight for the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. Even if the others whose rights you're fighting for, you may profoundly disagree with them. Profoundly. There's a few reasons to do that. Let's just begin with one. Let's start with humility. I don't know about y'all. Probably not. Probably different from me. But I've been wrong a lot in my life. And if I was zealously intolerant to everyone who disagreed with me, you know what I'd end up being? Zealously intolerant with people who are right. Many times. I can sit back and I can think of things that I've changed my mind on, things that I've been wrong on, sometimes factually wrong, sometimes morally wrong. And this idea of zealous intolerance coming from me, when I'm so flawed, when I'm so prone to error, it's arrogance. It's absolute arrogance. So being zealously intolerant when I could be wrong doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But we lack an immense amount of humility in this culture. Just an immense amount of humility. We're so sure we're right all the time. And I can tell you, you can ask in the Q&A, when have you been wrong? How much time have you got? So humility. Humility is a vitally important reason why that we need to do this. And then another one is also a simple virtue. Let's call it fellowship. Fellowship. Here's what I found. I have represented a lot of people in my life as a lawyer, and I've agreed with a lot of them. I thought a lot of them were awesome. I didn't agree with some of them. And I will tell you one thing, though. For the people that I disagreed with, and I got in the trenches and I defended their right to say things that I didn't believe were correct, there is a human bond that forms with a person. I know them. I understand them. They are fully human to me. I'm fully human to them. There is a level of grace and, shall I even say, affection that builds. I can't describe to you the number of relationships that I have made that I never would have made in my entire life had I not stepped out from outside of tribe and defended people I even profoundly disagree with. I'll give you a good example recently of a person I defended publicly, not in court because he didn't face a court challenge to his free speech rights. He faced a cultural and commercial challenge to his free speech rights. And I'm going to say this name and it's going to trigger some people. So trigger warning. I mean it. Every audience, largely conservative audience I've talked about this, somebody gets triggered. So I'm just going to tell you. Colin Kaepernick. Okay. I don't agree. I don't agree with him kneeling before the national anthem, guys. I'm just going to say this right now. But what I really, really didn't agree with was people clamoring for his head because he did so. I really didn't agree with that. Because I'd been around a conservative movement that was against cancel culture, that had said, look at all of these really intolerant people who say they cannot even work with a professor who's a Christian, a colleague who's a Christian, who got furious at Google when Google fired this guy named James Damore, who wrote a manifesto, a kind of libertarian manifesto about diversity hiring practices. And all of the conservative world said, no, you guys have no tolerance. None. You're snowflakes. You're engaging in cancel culture. And then this guy takes a knee at the national anthem and everyone's like, fire him. Okay, wait a minute. I think animosity is trumping a commitment to liberty. And doing so, interestingly enough, turns out when you yell, fire him, when you've had a cold, it makes you cough. And so, in a really particularly interesting way, because this notion of not raising for standing for the national anthem or not saluting the flag actually is the genesis of one of the greatest Supreme Court cases in the history of the United States, a case that has protected the religious liberty of the church and individual Christians for generations. And this case was born in January 1942. A lot of folks in here will know what January 1942 was like. These were the darkest days of World War II in the American experience. Now, a lot of people think of World War II like this, because we don't teach American history very much. Japanese attack us on December 7th, 1941. We're knocked back on our heels. Then, hashtag America, and they're surrendering on the USS Missouri. No. We got knocked on our heels in December 1941. We got knocked on our heels later in December 1941. We got knocked on our heels in January 42, February 42, March 42, April 42. We suffered some of the worst defeats in the history of the United States military in the 4 months after Pearl Harbor, including the Bataan Death March. At the same time, the Germans were the dominant force in Europe. They still had the Soviet Union on the ropes. We believed not just that America could fail, but Western civilization itself could fail. That's what was happening in January 1942. We can't even conceive of that now. We can't even conceive of that. That's the kind of fear. And so in January 1942, the West Virginia Board of Education passes a rule requiring all students to stand up and to salute the flag to start the day. Totally sensible, right? I mean, aren't you wanting to foster national unity? I mean, if not then, when? And a lot of these kids some of them are going to graduate from high school and go join the military. Some of their parents are already in the Army or Navy. I mean, if not then, when? So everybody stands, right? Not everybody. A couple of Jehovah's Witnesses don't. Now look, let me just say this. I don't like it when Jehovah's Witnesses knock on my door and give me the watchtower and all of that stuff. But if you knew how many of our fundamental liberties were guaranteed by some ornery Jehovah's Witnesses who wouldn't do what the state told them to do, you just invite them in for coffee. I'm not saying convert. I'm not even saying read the watchtower. I'm just saying be nice to them. Thank you for your ancestors protecting my freedom. So these two young women don't stand. Starts a case. Goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 1943, when the war is still hanging in the balance, by the way, D-Day hasn't happened yet. I mean, this could go either way. The Supreme Court issues a ruling in a case called West Virginia v. Barnett that says, if there is, and these words have echoed through constitutional history, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what is orthodox. And then the court goes on to list these categories of religion and politics and nationalism, or require you to vocalize your support for the state's principles. What an incredible protection for the rights of conscience. What an incredible protection. And it was born out of a desperate time in American history where people did what? They didn't salute the flag. And then conservatives, all too many conservatives, fast forward in a much less desperate time in American history. Look, Japan isn't running rampant through the South Pacific right now, except as tourists, okay? It's a much less desperate time, and instead of remembering these words of liberty that have protected so many of us for so many years, we go, fire him. That's when our animosity trumps our commitment to liberty. We're all prone to it. We all are. And so as I look at this age, and I look at the challenge to religious liberty, and I look at the challenge to free speech, and I look at the negative polarization that is dominating the United States of America and the culture of the United States of America, right now, I look at the law and I say, we're pretty good. It's actually pretty good. You won't believe this, but because we feel often so censored and silenced by the online world and cancel culture, etc., that right now in the United States of America, you are more free to speak, free from government interference, more free, arguably, to worship, free from government interference, more free to gather in religious associations, free from government interference, than virtually any time in American history. You're so free that we're just about on the verge, please God, to eliminate the last vestiges of some of the most odious anti-Catholic bigotry in American history. You all heard of the Blaine Amendment? The Blaine Amendments proposed by an anti-Catholic senator from Maine, which were passed in 37 states in the United States, that were disguised at the time, not even disguised, but now disguised anti-Catholic bigotry by banning any public support for sectarian schools or sectarian institutions. Because you have to remember, when these amendments were being passed, the public schools were Protestant schools, by and large. You would read the King James Version of the Bible. You would often open the day by praying a Protestant prayer. You would sing a Protestant hymn. And so when states banned sectarian funding. They weren't banning funding of Christian institutions. Those were the public schools. Sectarian meant Catholic. And there's a Supreme Court case right now that may eliminate these things once and for all. They've been narrowed and restricted and narrowed and restricted and kind of pushed embarrassingly to the side of constitutional law for a long time. Might eliminate them once and for all. And if that's the case, we may live in an era unprecedented in American history with unprecedented protection from the government. Just at the time when we fall apart because we hate each other so darn much. What a shame. What a shame. So when I think and I talk about Christian engagement in the culture, I've really started to emphasize, I used to for years, I'd emphasize liberty, liberty, liberty. But we have to be the instruments of the society that we would like to create. And the society that I would like to create is one that respects liberty, but also abandons animosity. And how can we abandon animosity if we feed it, even in the name of liberty? And so my call to a 18th century solution to a 21st century problem, or my 21st century twist on an 18th century solution, that's a really awkward sentence. But you know what I'm saying, is that we, people, believers in Jesus Christ, are called to defend liberty and called to fellowship with our fellow citizens. And how do we do that? You know, the human side of this in many ways is obvious. The legal side of it is, as I said, defending and advocating the principles that and liberties that we would seek to exercise ourselves. In court and in the court of public opinion, when state action is involved, when corporate action is involved, when university action is involved, in all spheres. And to do so and to persevere in spite of hatred directed at us. One of the most interesting things that you'll find often when you meet plaintiffs like, say, St. Vincent's in Michigan, or like many of the students and professors that I have represented, many of them have had an unbelievable mountain or ocean of hate thrown at them. But by the grace of God, they do not return hate with hate. They again and again return hate with love. And doing that at scale is a way through, perhaps the only way through, the hatred of the present. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you all very much.